All right. This is Jordan Sinclair from Devron. I'm the data scientist here, and I'm with Liron Brish, who is the VP of Sustainability and Product. And we are going to talk to you about Devron's carbon program. So we will give a little bit of an overview on the importance of carbon and then get into the voluntary carbon markets, what that really means, and just talk a little bit about that. Then we will specifically talk about Devron's carbon program that we'll be offering. And finally, touch on a little bit on how you can sequester carbon, and participate if you're going to participate. All right, so I think it's important. This is not a science lesson, but it is important for us to touch on some basics regarding carbon before we get started. The main things that I want to talk about are the fact that carbon is everywhere. And mainly we think about carbon existing in three pools on Earth, which is the atmosphere, land, and in the oceans, waters, but mostly the oceans. And specifically, when we talk about a carbon program for agriculture, we are interested in how we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere pool and put it into the land pool. And we want to keep it there. So we want to pull it out and put it into the land. The main way that that happens is through photosynthesis via plants. So when we talk about or think about how we can sequester carbon in agriculture, the main thing that we want to be thinking about is how can we utilize plants and the photosynthetic power to pull that carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it into the ground. That's the main takeaway. Right. Then I also like to touch on this bathtub analogy because if you're, if you're in the carbon circles, this is used a lot. And so basically the bathtub is representing that atmospheric carbon pool, and the tap is turned on always just naturally, and carbon is being released into the atmosphere. This happens through forest fires, naturally, and decomposition. And then the drain in the bathtub is the natural way that carbon is pulled from the atmosphere. So again, namely via photosynthesis and plants. But what's happening is that humans are artificially turning up the volume of that tap. So more water is being put into the atmosphere than the drain can naturally drain out. And so programs like the one we're going to show you today, they exist to help remove some of that carbon out of the atmosphere to stop the tub from running over.
So why are we here today? Why is there a carbon program? Why are you hearing about carbon? This is really it. At least a third, probably more by the time you see this little video, of the world's largest companies now have net zero targets. And what a net zero target means is that this company says we are going to sequester the same amount of carbon into the ground, essentially, as we release into the air via our use of energy, via the amount of driving that we do, whatever it may be. And so you've got a third of the world's largest companies saying they're going to do that. Why are they saying they're going to do that? Well, their investors are starting to demand that from them. And what that has created is a market for these companies trying to figure out how to sequester carbon, because that's not what they're in the business of doing. And that's the opportunity for you as a grower. You can sequester carbon with the farming that you do, and Jordan will go into detail on that, on how we can do that. But that's the opportunity for you. So whether you are cynical about what is going on, whether you are ecstatic about what is going on, the reality is there are people willing to pay you money today to sequester carbon into your soil. And how does that look like? In a very simplified manner, well, there's you on the left-hand side that is able to sequester carbon by planting your crops, by adopting a few best practices. Once you sequester that carbon, you create what is called a carbon credit, which you then sell to the carbon offset buyer. The carbon offset buyer may be Shopify, it may be Microsoft, it may be an investor, whoever it may be, that buys that carbon credit that you created, utilizes that as a carbon offset. Then on their end, they say, I released 1 ton of carbon, but I also helped sequester 1 ton of carbon as well. And then carbon market in the middle, that's essentially an intermediary. There are multiple folks serving this purpose. Devron has stepped in to serve this purpose, this function, specifically in the Ontario market. And so coming up in fall 2022, Devron is launching an Ontario-specific carbon program, which really means four things on what we're looking to do. One, it's going to be open to Ontario only currently. We are a Canadian company. We're based out of Ontario. We're very proud to be able to offer this to our customers, our growing customer list in Ontario. Two is to create a program that is flexible for you, meaning we don't want this to affect your day-to-day activities on the farm. We don't want this to affect anything that you're doing on the agronomic side. And so we've set up a program that allows you to be flexible while still allowing you to participate in the program. A program that is simple. We don't want to burden you with administrative aspects, bureaucratic aspects, whatever it may be. We understand you have a lot going on, and it's just one of many things. And so this program, the way we're setting it up, is built for it to be really simple for you. And then lastly, probably most importantly, something that is agronomically desirable. Everything that is included in our program is going to be something that, for the most part, you may already be doing on your farm, or you'd like to be doing, or you've thought about doing it. We're building out this program together with a group called B Carbon, based out of the States, which is a program that we're working with that is helping us build out our own program that adheres to all these aspects. So how does the program work? At a very simple level, you decide which of your fields you want to enroll. You let us know. We come out, we measure that baseline carbon for you. You continue to practice using best practice. You continue to farm using best practices while you get paid for sequestering carbon. And then around 5 years later, we'll come up and we'll do what's called a true-up carbon sampling, just to make sure that the amount of carbon that the program is expected to sequester is actually that amount that you have sequestered in real time, in real life. Our program is sample first, meaning everything, all the payments that come to you ultimately by the end of the program are going to be based on the amount of carbon that we sample in your field. The payment you get is not based on a model. It is not based on a we hope that this happens. It's actually based on the sampling that we do. And importantly, to participate in our program, there's no cost for Devron fertility sampling customers. We'll get back to that in a bit. And so the next question we usually get is, how is that payment calculated? How much am I as a farmer going to get paid? Well, it's a simple calculation. We take the carbon price of what Devron is willing to pay for a carbon ton. We multiply that by the amount of acres that you have enrolled in the program and by the amount of carbon that you have sequestered in order to get to the final value of carbon sequestered. So let's run through that math very quickly. Devron will be paying between $30 and $45 per carbon ton, which is more than the current market price. So let's take the midpoint of that, 37.5. Let's assume that you enroll 100 acres, and let's assume that you sequester 0.5 carbon tons per year over 5 years. So 3750 times 100 times 0.5 times 5, we come out to $9,375. Jordan will talk in more detail about how we got to that 0.5 carbon tons per year. But rest assured that that is something that we do believe is kind of a best case scenario of what you can achieve. Obviously, there are factors that influence that. And so how and when are you paid? In year one, when you sign up, we will do a baseline sample. You will share with us information on which practices you will be adopting over the next 5 years. Based off of that, we utilize a model, a conservative model that says we expect you to sequester X carbon tons over the next 5 years. Based off the market price of carbon, we're going to start paying you out in that year one. You're going to get 35% of that value, 20% in year two, and then 15% in years 3 through 5. At year 5, we will do that true up, as I mentioned. And at that point, if you have sequestered more carbon than that model had calculated that you would, you'll get an additional payment to cover that amount. If you sequester less carbon than that model calculated, but you have been adopting best practices and you have been sharing continuously with us what you're doing on the farm, there's no detriment, there's no clawback on that payment for you. Devron is taking on the risk that carbon will be sequestered in that field. So long as that you are adopting best practices and engaging with us and interacting with us, this is the amount that you will get paid. And so to talk about how we can actually sequester this carbon, I'll turn it back over to Jordan.
All right, great. So with the program that we're going to be running, there is no checkbox of you have to do practice A, you have to do practice B. We're really trying to stay as flexible as possible and leave that up to the individual farmer to decide. However, there are certain things that you can do that have been shown in the literature and or you might have heard in the media that people are doing to sequester carbon. And these are a couple of examples just to give you an idea. So the big one, again, if we go back to what I was talking about, the main way we're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is through plants. The first two here are probably no surprise. So cover crops. This is a really pretty big opportunity, I would say. It's not just that we want cover crops to be utilized, but it's the length of time you're going to keep them on your field, right? You want live roots in the ground as long as possible. You want plant cover on your field as long as possible. You could mix this up with different species, multi-species, and try different things. And so cover crops kind of covers a large area. So you might see there that we have a range of 0.44 to 0.89 tons of carbon per acre per year. That comes from some research out of the University of Guelph, Ridgetown campus, so this is research that's done in our backyard. And the range is there because, as I said, different cover crops are going to have different biomasses. They're going to stay on for different lengths of time. So there is, a range that's seen based on which species you're planting and how long you're keeping it there. Another example is rotating crops. And I will point out this practice has a range of 0 to 0.89. And that's because, again, a lot of this is dependent on diversity and also length of time that the crops are, your field is covered in crops. So if you have a corn, wheat, bean rotation and you rotate in an additional crop, but it happens to be like edible beans or something, we really have no reason to believe that that's going to increase the amount of carbon that you're going to sequester, right? There's really not a lot of diversity there. If, on the other hand, you decide to rotate in a perennial or alfalfa, something like this, then you have a real opportunity to capture some carbon. The third example is a land use change. So it's really important for us to stress that we are not interested in converting your farmland to some non-farmland. But in a lot of scenarios, it makes sense to plant a buffer strip, perhaps by a drain or in some low-lying area of your field, and or plant a windrow, right? These are common practices that are good agronomic decisions. And they're really, the land use change is a wonderful way to sequester carbon, because while you're putting a perennial there and you're leaving it there, you're not touching it. So you will get credit for carbon sequestered through land use change. And then utilizing no-till, we have an NA there. And the reason is because in Southwestern Ontario, there's really mixed messaging in the research that's been done. There are some studies that have shown no-till does sequester more carbon than conventional till or reduced tillage. And then there are also studies that exist that show the exact opposite. So all this is to say that you can certainly utilize no-till or reduced till system, but we are not going to attribute any carbon to the model. So that's the estimate. So you won't be paid initially for this practice. But if you think that you're going to sequester carbon this way, that's wonderful. You can try it. And at the end of that 5-year period, when we have our true up, if it worked, if you sequestered carbon, you will be paid the true up at that point in time. The last one we have up here is incorporating livestock, and similarly, we've put, not applicable or not available because there's just such a variety of ways you can incorporate livestock, and the research just doesn't exist for all those different scenarios and how much carbon is potentially sequestered. But for one example of what incorporating livestock might look like is if you're growing cover crops or you leave residue in your field and then put up a temporary fence around that field and graze some livestock on that at the end of the season or over winter, that they're adding manure and potentially will increase your carbon stocks. So, all right, so our let's get real slide. This is pretty important. We want to set realistic expectations, and the main one is that you're not going to get rich off of this carbon program, right? There has been some media out there that has some astronomical numbers, and the reality is row cropping in southwestern Ontario, you're not going to sequester mass amounts of carbon. We really think that probably the high end of obtainable is that 0.5 tons per acre per year. You may sequester less than that. That's a very real possibility. And the likelihood that you will sequester more than that is also unlikely. And you might recall that specifically for cover crops, you said, well, it was possible to go up to 0.89. Why didn't we use that number? And the reason is because, again, if you're making every single decision just to maximize carbon sequestration in your farm, you're probably going to have some pretty significant agronomic trade-offs for that. And so we just really don't think that that most people will choose to maximize the amount of carbon that they can sequester on their land, right? If you're planting a cover crop that has a lot of biomass, that is your best way to sequester that 0.89 tons per acre per year. However, you're going to be producing a lot of residue that's going to be on your field, and you need to think about what that means for your management as a whole. So it is possible to go above, but we really think that people should have that 0.5 in mind if you're going to work out your numbers. All right. So why would you do this? Well, pretty much all of these practices are of an agronomic benefit to you. So, we want people to keep that in mind. If you're already utilizing these practices, then this carbon program can offer you a little bit of money to help offset that. And if you were maybe on the edge or deciding these payoffs can maybe help you get over that hump, right? And help you start implementing these costs. But we just really, it's important to set some realistic expectations. The final point there just mentions that carbon sequestration takes time. So that true up after 5 years, we may or may not see significant sequestration after that. Changing soil in general takes a long time, carbon specifically. So we need to be patient, and really it's important to know that when you sign up for this program, we're looking for a 10-year commitment. And that's pretty necessary because, we need that length of time to actually be able to sequester measurable amounts of carbon in the soil. All right, so that segues into the requirements for participation. The first is that you must be a Devron fertility sampling customer. So one thing that we are offering is the carbon sampling at no cost to the farmer. And this is significant. It's not cheap to do this kind of sampling. However, if we're already at the field, we're already doing your fertility sampling, then we are going to, cover that carbon sampling, at least for now. And that's, we're hoping that eliminates a barrier for entry for most of you. The second practice is, so the no-till or minimal till. We said we're not going to dictate what practices you can do or need to do. However, there are certain things that are required by some standards regulators. So, for example, you cannot go and burn residue. If you do something like that, you'll be kicked out of the program. If you go and really turn over, deep plowing or aggressive plowing multiple times a year, again, you'll be politely let go from the program, because the fact of the matter is we're trying to sequester carbon, and Devron is taking on the risk in the short term, with that payment. And so if you're participating or if you're doing some practice that we know releases carbon into the atmosphere or goes directly against the kind of what we're trying to do here, then then you can't participate. So the next bullet point there is that the land has to be privately owned. So the contract that we have needs to be with or in conjunction with the landowner. I think this makes sense. Again, considering that we're looking at a 10-year commitment, and this is a long-term investment. And then that next one is just talking about that 10-year rolling commitment. And then finally, we need you to be willing to share your data continuously. I think in order to get carbon credits certified at the end of the program, we need to put together a report and submit that. And it needs to be fairly fairly detailed. And so there's no way that we can do that if we don't have the participation, the back and forth with the grower. So that's really vitally important.
And lastly, if you are interested, if we've piqued your interest a little bit, we will be rolling out more details of the program in August in anticipation for fall baseline sampling, as Jordan mentioned, alongside with fertility sampling. And you can go to devron.com/Ontario Carbon to sign up just to get updates. There's no commitments required at this point. And as we roll out more details, we will share those with everybody. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. There's obviously a lot of details to figure out on whether this makes sense for you. And hopefully our goal is to build out a program that does make sense for you, the Ontario farmer. And so please do sign up. We will keep you updated and we can continue the conversation. We appreciate your time.
Thanks very much.